What do you really know about medieval women and violence, or lack thereof? Did women in the Middle Ages always live sheltered lives, far from the brutal realities of their world? Were they always victims, never perpetrators, or even defenders of their own fate across the years from the 5th to the 15th century? Number 5. Notion 5. All violence involving women was sexual or domestic. Well, think about the images that often pop into your head when you picture medieval women and violence. A common story usually involves a woman in a castle, perhaps the victim of a jealous husband, or a peasant woman facing the dangers of her home. These stories, while sometimes true, capture only a tiny fraction of the often complex relationship medieval women had with violence, a relationship that stretched far beyond the confines of a bedroom or a kitchen. The idea that all violence involving women during the medieval period, which typically spans from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was purely sexual or domestic overlooks a vast landscape of other conflicts and dangers. Historical records, like the judicial rolls from various English courts, sometimes reveal women entangled in disputes that had nothing to do with their romantic lives or household quarrels. For instance, in the bustling towns and growing cities of the 13th and 14th centuries, guilds were powerful forces, controlling trades and setting rules for their members. While these guilds were often dominated by men, women played crucial roles in many crafts, from brewing and weaving to selling goods in the market. When disputes arose between rival guilds, or even within a guild over access to resources or trade secrets, women could find themselves right in the thick of it. Records from the court of the mayor of London in the 13th century, for example, show instances where women, identified as brewers or shopkeepers, were fined or even imprisoned for participating in brawls that broke out over market stalls or accusations of unfair trading practices. These were not domestic spats but economic skirmishes where the stakes were often their livelihoods. Beyond the marketplace, medieval society was frequently rocked by broader social and economic unrest. Peasant revolts, like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, were massive uprisings driven by grievances over taxation, labor laws, and social injustices. While chronicles often focus on male leaders like Wat Tyler and John Ball, contemporary accounts and later historical studies, such as the work by historians like Caroline Barron, show that women were not just passive observers. They were active participants, sometimes leading groups, sometimes joining in the destruction of manor houses or the burning of legal documents that symbolized their oppression. The French Jacquerie of 1358 also saw women among the ranks of the rebellious peasantry. Their involvement often arose from shared community hardship, not personal domestic issues. Their anger was directed at institutions, at lords, and at the perceived unfairness of the system, rather than at an individual partner. Even outside organized revolts, localized disputes over land and resources frequently erupted into violence. In rural communities, access to common lands, water sources, or even rights to timber could become fiercely contested. Women, often deeply invested in the survival of their households and families, were not strangers to these conflicts. Their legal documents from the 14th century, particularly from manorial courts across England, sometimes detail women being involved in boundary disputes that escalated into physical altercations. A woman might be accused of assaulting a neighbor who encroached on her family's grazing land, or of tearing down a fence erected on disputed territory. These were often disputes of property and survival rather than personal relationships. Banditry and crime also offered another facet of violence where women were involved outside the domestic sphere. While the stereotype of the medieval bandit is often male, women could also be victims of roadside attacks, or, less commonly but not unheard of, participants in criminal gangs. Records from the Scottish borders, a notoriously lawless region in the late medieval period, occasionally mention women who were part of raiding parties or who harbored outlaws. Their involvement can be born out of economic necessity, family loyalty, or simply a life lived on the fringes of society where survival often meant recourse to illegal means. These instances were about plunder, survival, or criminal enterprise, far removed from the confines of a marital quarrel. Furthermore, medieval legal systems, though harsh, recognized a wide range of crimes beyond the domestic or sexual spheres. Women could be accused of theft, arson, witchcraft, or even murder for reasons entirely unrelated to their personal relationships. For example, a woman might be accused of poisoning a rival for political power within a town, or of burning down a barn belonging to someone with whom her family had a long-standing feud. A woman might be executed for counterfeiting currency, a crime with significant economic implications, not domestic ones. The legal records themselves stand as a testament to the diverse ways women encountered or engaged with violence. They were not exclusively victims of sexual assault or domestic abuse, they were also victims of robbery, perpetrators of economic crimes, or participants in community-wide social unrest. The tapestry of medieval violence, when viewed through the lens of women's experiences, reveals far more threads than just the domestic or the sexual. Number 4. Notion 4. Women in power queens. Noble women were exempt from violence or used it only indirectly. When thinking about medieval queens and noblewomen, pictures of elaborate gowns, courtly intrigues, and diplomatic marriages often come to mind. There is a common assumption that these powerful women, by virtue of their status and often their gender, were either completely shielded from physical violence, or that they only ever wielded power through subtle persuasion and indirect machinations. This notion, however, does not fully capture the harsh realities of medieval political life, where even the highest-ranking women could be targets of brutal force or, at times, orchestrators of it themselves. The lines between political influence and direct violence were often blurred, and a woman's high status was no absolute shield against the raw power of the sword or the prison cell. One powerful example comes from the turbulent 13th century in England with Eleanor of Provence, queen consort of King Henry III. While she certainly used her significant diplomatic skills and family connections to advance her interests and those of her children, she was also a direct target of mob violence. During the contentious period leading up to the Second Barons' War, in 1263, Eleanor attempted to sail down the Thames from London, a city hostile to her due to her perceived foreign influence and the king's unpopular policies. As her barge passed under London Bridge, a furious mob attacked her. They hurled stones, rotten eggs, and other refuse, forcing her to turn back. This was not a subtle political slight. It was a direct physical assault on the person of the queen, demonstrating that even a figure of such elevated rank could be subjected to the raw, visceral anger of the populace. Her regality offered no protection against a determined crowd. Noblewomen, too, often found themselves directly involved in the violence of feuds and warfare. The medieval period was characterized by frequent local conflicts between powerful families, often over land, inheritance, or perceived slights to honor. When their husbands or male relatives were away fighting, imprisoned, or killed, noblewomen were frequently tasked with defending their castles and estates. These were not merely symbolic acts. They involved the logistical challenges of provisioning a siege, commanding a garrison, and even participating in the direct defense of fortifications. The Chronicle of Froissart, a vivid account of the Hundred Years' War, contains numerous tales of noble women heroically defending their castles against enemy forces. One such account describes Jeanne de Montfort during the War of the Breton Succession in the mid-14th century. When her husband was captured, she personally took command of the loyalist forces, donned armor, and rode among her troops, inspiring them to continue fighting. She actively participated in a siege, leading a counterattack from the castle of Hennebont, burning the enemy's tents and supplies. This was direct military action, not indirect influence. Beyond defensive roles, women in power sometimes initiated violence or became victims of politically motivated violence. Consider Isabella of France, queen consort of Edward II of England in the early 14th century. Her story is a dramatic one of political betrayal and rebellion. When her husband proved ineffective and favored male companions over his queen and nobility, Isabella formed a powerful alliance with Roger Mortimer. Together, they launched an invasion of England, leading an army that deposed Edward II. While Isabella herself did not wield a sword on the battlefield, she was the driving force behind the military campaign, a clear act of organized violence aimed at overthrowing a king. Her actions ultimately led to her husband's brutal murder, an act of violence she almost certainly sanctioned, even if she did not personally commit it. This was not indirect influence. It was the orchestration of a coup d'etat with all its inherent violent consequences. The Wars of the Roses in 15th century England offer more examples. Margaret of Anjou, queen consort of Henry VI, was a formidable figure who directly led armies and fiercely campaigned for the Lancastrian cause. She was not a passive queen, but a military strategist and commander. She rode on horseback with her troops, engaged in recruitment, and personally oversaw battle plans. Her actions led directly to several major battles and widespread bloodshed. She was a central figure in a long and brutal civil war, navigating a landscape of constant threat and employing force to achieve her political aims. Her actions were not just influencing policy, they were determining the course of a bloody conflict. Even when not directly commanding troops, women in power could be targets of political violence. Imprisonment was a common fate for deposed queens or noble women whose families lost favor or power. For example, after the Norman Conquest, Anglo-Saxon noblewomen faced confiscation of their lands and sometimes imprisonment as a means of control. Later, after the failed rebellion against King John in the early 13th century, members of the powerful de Braose family, including Matilda de Braose, were cruelly starved to death in royal custody. This was a direct, brutal act of violence by the crown against a noblewoman and her son, meant to break her family's resistance. Her high status did not protect her from the king's wrath and his methods of control. These historical accounts complicate the notion that women in power were somehow above or apart from the direct application of force in the medieval world. Their lives were often perilous, their power hard won, and their involvement in violence, whether as direct commanders, orchestrators, or targets, was an undeniable part of the political landscape. The medieval throne or noble estate was no sanctuary from the era's raw, often brutal, power struggles. Number 3. Notion 3. Violence against women was always accepted and unpunished in the Middle Ages. The popular image of the Middle Ages often paints a picture of a brutal, lawless society where women had few rights and violence against them went unchecked. It is easy to assume that in such a harsh environment, acts of aggression against women were simply a part of daily life, accepted without question or consequence. This idea, however, overlooks the complex legal, social, and religious frameworks that existed, imperfect as they were, and which often sought to regulate and punish various forms of violence, including those against women. While justice was certainly not always swift or fair and depended heavily on social standing and local customs, it is not accurate to say that all violence against women was simply accepted or went entirely unpunished. Medieval legal systems, ranging from royal courts to local manorial courts and church courts, did indeed address various forms of assault, injury, and even murder. While the concept of individual rights as we understand them today was absent, the legal systems were deeply concerned with maintaining peace, preventing feuds, and upholding social order. An act of violence against a woman was often seen as a breach of the king's peace, an offense against the community, or a sin against God. For instance, records from English royal courts, like the assize rolls from the 13th and 14th centuries, show numerous cases where men were indicted, tried, and sometimes punished for assault, rape, and homicide involving women. Rape, though often difficult to prove and carrying a heavy burden of proof on the victim, was a serious crime under both common law and ecclesiastical law. While convictions were not always guaranteed, the fact that cases were brought forward, witnesses were called, and judgments were rendered demonstrates that such violence was not legally condoned. A man found guilty of rape could face imprisonment, mutilation, or even execution, depending on the severity of the crime and the prevailing laws of the region. Historians studying these court records, like Judith Bennett, have highlighted the agency some women displayed in bringing these charges forward, navigating a complex legal system to seek redress. Furthermore, church courts played a significant role in regulating behavior and morality. While they could not issue death penalties, they could impose spiritual punishments like excommunication, public penance, or fines for a range of offenses, including domestic violence and marital abuse. Church teachings condemned unprovoked violence and emphasized the sanctity of marriage, even if they often reinforced patriarchal structures. A husband who severely beat his wife could face reprimand from his parish priest or even be brought before the bishop's court, especially if the violence was extreme and public, causing scandal. The concept of wergold, or man price, in early medieval Germanic law offers another perspective. This system assigned a monetary value to every person, and if someone was injured or killed, the offender or their family had to pay a specific amount of compensation to the victim or their family. While the wergold for a woman might have been different from that of a man of similar social standing, the existence of such a system meant that violence was not simply ignored. It had a tangible cost, and a legal mechanism for redress existed, even if it primarily focused on preventing blood feuds rather than individual justice as we might understand it today. These payments served as a form of punishment and a means of preventing escalating violence between families. Social repercussions also played a role. While direct legal punishment might not always have occurred, an individual who committed egregious acts of violence against a woman could face social ostracism, damage to their reputation, or even retaliatory violence from the victim's family or community. The honor of a family, particularly a noble family, was paramount, and an assault on a female member could be seen as an insult demanding vengeance. This could lead to private feuds and vendettas, which, while extra-legal, served as a powerful deterrent for some. The The records from the city of Norwich in the late 14th century, for example, show instances of public outcry against men accused of violence, indicating that communal disapproval could be a significant force. It is crucial to acknowledge that medieval justice was not equitable. Women of lower social standing, or those without powerful family connections, often found it more difficult to seek justice. The testimony of women was sometimes viewed with suspicion, and the legal process could be slow, expensive, and intimidating. But these difficulties do not equate to a complete absence of legal and social mechanisms for addressing violence. Cases that ended in acquittal, or were dropped, often reveal the complexities of evidence and power dynamics, rather than a blanket acceptance of violence. In summary, the medieval period had a legal framework that, however imperfect, did recognize and seek to punish various forms of violence against women. From royal decrees to local customs, from church law to compensation systems, there were mechanisms in place to address such acts. While the scale of justice was often tilted, and many acts of violence undoubtedly went unpunished, the notion that violence against women was universally accepted or never met with legal or social consequence is a simplification that ignores the historical realities of medieval legal and social life. Number 2. Notion 2. Medieval women were only targets of male violence. The common narrative about medieval women often positions them solely as victims, particularly of male aggression. This viewpoint overlooks a significant aspect of medieval society. Women were not only targets of violence, but could also be perpetrators, sometimes against men, and certainly against other women, or as active participants in broader social conflicts. The medieval world was a harsh place for everyone, and survival often meant engaging in various forms of conflict, a reality that did not exclude women, regardless of their social standing. Historical court records, such as those from English quarter sessions and coroner's inquests, often provide startling glimpses into the realities of daily life where women were involved in violence. These records reveal numerous cases of women committing assaults, engaging in brawls, and even murder. For instance, in the late medieval period, disputes between women in towns and villages over property, reputation, or personal grievances could escalate into physical altercations. Records from the city of York in the 15th century contain accounts of women attacking each other with knives, staves, or even household implements like rolling pins during heated arguments. These were not always simple fights. Some resulted in serious injuries or even death. The violence was often immediate and personal, arising from the close-knit and often competitive nature of medieval communities. Women also committed violence against men. While less frequent than male-on-male violence, instances exist where women were accused of assaulting or killing men. These acts could stem from self-defense, revenge, or desperate circumstances. A woman might attack an abusive husband, a landlord who sought to exploit her, or a stranger who posed a threat. For example, some legal records contain accounts of women being charged with the murder of their husbands, often through poisoning or by hiring others, suggesting a desperate attempt to escape oppressive or violent situations. Such cases were serious and often led to severe punishment, including execution, but their existence challenges the idea of women's universal passivity. Beyond individual acts, women also participated in broader forms of collective violence, such as urban riots and peasant rebellions. While often overshadowed by male leaders, women were present in the mobs that stormed prisons, burned down buildings, or confronted authorities during periods of social unrest. During the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, chroniclers mention women among the rebels who ransacked properties and destroyed legal documents. Their motivations were often rooted in shared economic hardship and a desire for social change, aligning with the broader grievances of the community. In Paris, during the Maillotins' Revolt of 1382, women were noted among the rioters who wielded hammers mallets against tax collectors and symbols of royal authority. These were not domestic disputes, but acts of political and social protest where women actively contributed to the physical force of the rebellion. Even in the context of warfare and feuds, women were not always sideline figures. While they might not have typically served as knights on the battlefield, they were often involved in the logistics of warfare, the defense of castles, and even the orchestration of violence through political maneuvering. As mentioned previously, noblewomen sometimes took direct command in defending their castles during sieges, ordering their garrisons, and participating in strategic decisions that led to violent encounters. Some chronicles also mention women who acted as spies or messengers in times of war, roles that inherently carried risks of violence and often required a capacity for ruthless action. The concept of honor played a significant role in medieval society, and women too were concerned with their personal and family honor. An insult or perceived slight to a woman's reputation could provoke a violent response, either from her male relatives or sometimes from the woman herself. This was not just about sexual honor, but about social standing and respect within the community. A woman might engage in a public brawl to defend her reputation against accusations of theft or infidelity, showing a willingness to use physical force to protect her social standing. Finally, while often associated with women, practices like witchcraft accusations led to extreme violence being inflicted upon women. Yet, it is also important to remember that some women were accused of using harmful magic against others, and these accusations, whether true or not, indicate a perceived capacity for women to inflict harm, even if through supernatural means. The historical evidence demonstrates that medieval women were complex individuals who navigated a violent world in various ways. They were victims, certainly, but also survivors, defenders, and, at times, perpetrators of violence. To categorize them solely as targets of male aggression misses the dynamic and often brutal ways they asserted their will, defended their interests, or participated in the wider conflicts of their time. The idea that violence involving women was exclusively one-sided simplifies a rich and often unsettling aspect of medieval history. Number one, medieval women were completely passive victims of violence. One of the most persistent and pervasive notions about medieval women is that they were perpetually passive, helpless victims, often waiting to be rescued or enduring whatever violence was inflicted upon them without resistance. This portrayal, popularized by certain fictional narratives, dramatically oversimplifies the diverse realities of women's lives in the medieval period, which spanned roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries. Historical records, from court documents to chronicles and personal letters, offer a more nuanced picture, revealing countless instances where women actively resisted violence, defended themselves and their families, or even initiated acts of aggression in a world where survival often demanded courage and resilience. Consider the daily lives of peasant women, who formed the vast majority of the medieval population. Their existence was often precarious, marked by hard labor, natural disasters, and the ever-present threat of famine or disease. Yet, they were far from passive. When their lands were threatened, their harvests seized, or their homes encroached upon, they often participated directly in defending their livelihoods. Manorial court rolls from across England, such as those studied by historians like Barbara Hannawalt, frequently record instances of peasant women engaging in physical disputes over property boundaries, resisting attempts by bailiffs to collect unfair dues, or even participating in collective actions against oppressive lords. A woman might be fined for assaulting a neighbor who encroached on her common grazing rights, or for joining a group of villagers who resisted the seizure of their livestock. These were not acts of passivity, but direct assertions of their rights and interests. In times of war or unrest, women, regardless of their social class, often found themselves on the front lines of defense. While men typically served as knights or soldiers, women played crucial roles in defending castles, towns, and homes during sieges or raids. For chronicles like those of Froissart describe scenes where women actively participated in the defense of besieged fortifications. They might haul stones and boiling water to the battlements to hurl down on attackers, organize provisions for the defenders, or even man makeshift defenses alongside men. A famous, though perhaps partly legendary, example is Jeanne Hachette, a French peasant woman who, in 1472, is said to have rallied the women of Beauvais to repel a Burgundian assault on their town, seizing an axe hachette and fighting bravely. While her story might contain elements of myth, it reflects a broader historical reality of women's active participation in urban defense. The women of many towns knew that a siege meant potential death, starvation, or worse, and they fought for their lives and their families. Beyond large-scale conflicts, personal self-defense was a reality for many women. The medieval cities and roads could be dangerous places, and women were not always accompanied or protected. Their legal records, such as those found in coroners' inquests, occasionally detail instances where women, faced with assault or robbery, fought back. A woman might use a knife she carried for daily tasks, a stout stick, or even her bare hands to resist an attacker. While often at a physical disadvantage, such acts show agency and a refusal to simply submit to violence. These records often present matter-of-fact accounts, simply stating that a woman fought back, indicating that it was a recognized, if not common, response to threat. Moreover, women often sought legal redress for violence committed against them, a process that required considerable courage and determination in a patriarchal legal system. For example, women brought accusations of rape to court, often enduring public scrutiny and the burden of proof. While convictions were often difficult to secure, the act of initiating a lawsuit, testifying, and pursuing justice was itself an act of resistance against the notion of passive victimhood. They actively engaged with the legal machinery, seeking to hold their attackers accountable rather than simply accepting their fate. Historians who have examined these court records have shown how women used the available legal mechanisms, however flawed, to advocate for themselves. Even in the domestic sphere, where violence from husbands or male relatives could occur, women were not always without recourse. While society often granted husbands significant authority, extreme abuse could lead to interventions by family, community, or even church authorities. Some women might flee their homes, seek refuge with relatives, or appeal to ecclesiastical courts for separation or protection. While these options were often limited and challenging, they reveal active attempts to escape or mitigate violence, rather than simply enduring it silently. The notion of medieval women as purely passive victims also ignores the strategic intelligence and sheer tenacity many displayed in navigating a world rife with danger. Their forms of resistance might not always have been overtly physical, they could involve cunning, alliances, or psychological warfare. But these too were active responses to potential or actual violence aimed at survival and protection. The medieval world was a brutal tapestry, and women, far from being static threads, actively wove their own stories of resistance, survival, and sometimes even aggression, challenging the easy assumption of universal passivity.